Hey you! Welcome back! Today we are going to talk about the idea of showing versus telling and 3 ways it can apply to your writing. So, I am beta reading for a fellow YouTuber in her work, and I am loving it. I am enjoying it, and it is not only giving me inspiration to work on my own work, but it has been fun. I've never beta read for someone before, but I am deeply, deeply enjoying it. And one of the things that I thought about while I was beta reading for her is the idea of showing versus telling, and how oftentimes this idea is difficult for writers to understand unless they are taught a little bit about it or they take the time to read a little bit about it. So I thought I would make a video on the idea. I'm sure there are lots of videos out there that already talk about this, but why not have one more? So let's go ahead and look at it. Like I said in the intro, I've got 3 ways that you can incorporate this into your writing. So let's go ahead and get started with those. So the first way you can incorporate the idea of showing versus telling or telling versus showing into your writing is just as an overall concept. And as you are working on your piece, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, or even poetry, honestly, you can incorporate these ideas into your writing from the very beginning, from beginning to end, in whichever one fits best in that moment. So let's look at an overall idea of showing versus telling before we move on to the second 2. What is telling versus showing or showing versus telling? Well, first let's define each of these words so that we understand what they are not. Showing is this idea of presenting the information without coming out and saying it. So let's say, for instance, you're talking about the fact that it is cold outside where your characters are, like it is today. So I could say, it was cold outside. That's telling. You are telling the reader it is cold outside. When I call my mom and talk to her on the phone, if she didn't live down the street from me, I would say, it is cold outside. I'm not going to describe to her what it is like so that she gets the idea. I'm going to tell her. So that's telling. Now, if you are showing somebody that it is cold outside, like you generally want to do in a narrative fashion for stories or poetry, fiction or nonfiction, whatever it is you're working on, cue the big truck. You are going to use descriptors and work it into the narrative. So say your character is going outside. He has prepared himself for the fact that it is cold outside. What would your character have on? Probably a coat, probably a scarf, probably a hat. So rather than saying, John stepped outside and it's cold outside, or John stepped outside and it was cold, you could say, John stepped outside and pulled his coat a little bit tighter against the wind. This implies not only that it's cold, but that the wind is cold and that the wind is making it colder. So you have shown your readers that it is cold, and they get the understanding that it is cold in the statement, John stepped outside and pulled his coat a little bit tighter against the wind. You have not explicitly said, it is cold, but your reader gathers that from what you are showing them. The idea of showing rather than telling invites your readers into the scene. It invites them to feel what your characters are feeling in a little bit more intimate of a way. And this is why oftentimes writers would prefer to show rather than tell. So this is kind of an overarching understanding of what showing versus telling is. So this is a basic understanding of what the difference is between showing and telling, and it helps you present your readers with a scene that's a little bit more believable and that they are able to be invited into and they are able to participate in as part of the reading experience. So let's look at the next 2, which are a little bit more detailed in the way that you can put them into your writing. The second way you can incorporate showing versus telling or telling versus showing into your writing is during dialogue. Now, this is one of the easiest ways to get caught up into telling versus showing when you really should be showing, because it's so much easier as a writer to just tell your audience rather than showing. So let's take a look really quick at a basic dialogue example. Let's say you have two characters. One has hurt the other's feelings unintentionally, and they haven't really picked up on it yet, but as a reader, we are starting to pick up on it. So you could tell your reader something along these lines. I know, Susie said, her feelings were hurt. Or her feelings hurt. Something like that. You tell them her feelings are hurt. So why don't you instead show them that her feelings are hurt without saying it as much? Such as, I know, Sally said, her wringing her hands and pulling her arms in tight while taking a step away from Sam. These present these ideas of there's something wrong. She's pulling away from this other character, and generally based on what happened earlier in the dialogue, we are able to understand that it is because he said something that hurt her feelings, or because she's upset about something, rather than, I know, Sally said, her feelings hurt. And this invites, again, the reader into the scene. It invites them to be a participant in what their characters are going through and to understand the interactions in a deeper way. So next time you are writing dialogue, rather than just saying what your characters are feeling, such as her feelings were hurt, she was sad, she sounded sad, tell them what it was in her demeanor that made her sad, that helped the other characters pick up on the fact that she was sad. Did she avert her eyes? Did she clasp her hands? Did she tear up? What was it that made the other characters pick up on the fact that she was sad and share that with the readers? This helps the readers to feel as though they too are a character in the story and that they can be invited into this scene and participate in your work along with the characters. So our third way and final way that you can incorporate telling versus showing, or showing versus telling, into your work is in character descriptions or development. This is often the most difficult for writers to do because, again, it is easy for them to just sit down and say, she was tall, she had brown hair, she had a unibrow, she had a scar that ran down the side of her face. It's easier for the writer to tell you those things and in how they envision the character and have developed the character physically for themselves, when they could incorporate it more into the story. And oftentimes description and development is difficult to show rather than tell, which is why oftentimes writers tell it, just because it requires more thought. A personal example, in a way I opted to show rather than tell my readers about a physical feature of one of my characters, is that he has a scar that runs over his mouth. And when he smiles, it distorts part of his smile. And so this is important because it allows other characters to recognize him later on. It is a very distinguishing trait of his character, and he's a well-known character where he lives, and so it is a distinguishing characteristic that he has, and it is important that the readers know this about him. But rather than just saying he was tall with dark hair and a scar over his mouth, I incorporated it into part of a dialogue that two characters had. We have two characters. They have met for the first time and are having a conversation. She notices, because a lot of the story is told from the female's perspective, she notices that when he smiles, the scar distorts his smile. And there's a really awkward scene during one of their first conversations because she's staring at him because of the scar. And he notices it and he comments on it and tells her that he caught it falling off of a horse as a child. So rather than just her saying, and he had a scar on his mouth, she observes something about the scar, something that catches her eye and causes a dialogue interaction. And in this, we see more of a showing way to describe the character. Now, all of this being said about the goodness of showing instead of telling, there are times in which you need to tell your readers things instead of showing them. There are times when it is appropriate to say, after his trip, he got home and put his suitcase away. That's telling. Instead of going through this big, long, drawn out, one whole page worth of how tired he was after his trip and he had put his suitcase away, when that has nothing to do with the story and all it's going to do is bog down your plot. Telling has its place and it has its time, as long as your whole story isn't telling. The majority of your story and your narrative and your prose should be showing, not just because it sounds better, but because it invites the reader to become invested in your work. It invites them into the scenes, it invites them into the feelings, it invites them into your story. And in order to invite your reader into your work, showing helps a lot rather than telling. So I hope you enjoyed all of those ways you can show instead of tell, or find places in which you should be telling instead of showing. And I hope that you learned something from this video. And as always, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate every single one of you. If you are new here, I would invite you to take this time to subscribe and ring that little bell down below so that you can get notified when I update new content, which I'm going to try to start doing once a week, because twice a week was overwhelming and I wasn't updating regularly, and I need to be. So take that time to subscribe and ring that little bell, and I hope to see you all out here in the future, and I appreciate every single one of you. Bye.